Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bob McCall, publisher of Continuity Insights, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Addressing Supply Chain Chaos and Disruption, Increasing the Resilience of Your Supply Chain, which will be presented by Linda Nelson, President of I-Corps. Today's broadcast is being sponsored by OnSolve. In your efforts in building a more resilient organization, you need visibility into your supply to ensure that strategies exist to manage supply risk, continuity, and security. With the uncertainty of the past 2 years leading to supply chain disruptions globally and the increasingly complex supply chain systems, it is now more important than ever to build resilience into your supply chain. During today's webinar, Linda will discuss how to reduce supply chain risk, increase supply chain security, and strengthen the continuity of your supply chain. Before we get started, just a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing into the questions pane of your control panel. You may submit questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address as many as we can at the end of the webinar. If you feel your question may require a bit more detailed explanation than can be addressed here, be sure to email our speaker so that she can respond to you directly. Today's webinar will also be recorded for later on-demand viewing, and all attendees will receive a link to this recording. Linda will also be making available a list of the many resources referenced in her presentation. I would now like to introduce our speaker. Linda Nelson is founder and president of the International Consortium for Organizational Resilience, or I-Corps. Established in 2005, I-Corps provides education and certification to individuals on how to build more resilient organizations and communities. Linda manages the day-to-day operations of I-Corps' education and credentialing programs. As a member of the U.S. delegation to the ISO TC 292 series of standards, Linda is an expert on international standards for business continuity management systems, crisis management and communications, and community resilience. She also contributed to the development of ISO 22216 organizational resilience principles and attributes. In addition, she is a member of TC 268 and contributes to standards related to community, urban, rural resilience. So please join me in welcoming Linda Nelson.
Well, thank you, Bob. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you guys today. So as Bob said, our webinar objectives are to reduce your supply chain risk and increase your supply chain security and strengthen the continuity of your supply chain. Whoops, sorry, I moved my mouse the wrong direction. You also need, in order to do that, we need to gain visibility into the links and nodes in both the supply and your value chains. And then be able to evaluate the vulnerabilities and capabilities of your supply chain itself. So we've seen a ton of things. In fact, I was just watching the news before just this morning and saw the president was on talking about what he's trying to do to help with this global supply chain disruption and what we're really seeing in the US. And we know that as a result of our economy starting to emerge from the pandemic, that it has created new problems. So here we thought the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic was going to be great, and it is great, but how it is creating problems in the global supply chain. And so, this is caused by a lot of reasons, some of which are those, the shutdowns that we had, and when we saw industries having to shut down, we saw a lower consumer demand. You were all home. We were all sitting at home when we weren't doing all the things that we normally did. And so just having those sorts of things happen has been really contributors to the beginning of the supply chain disruption. And sad to say that for a lot of people in the world and a lot of countries in the world, what they're telling us is that the supply chain disruptions could actually get worse before they get better. And so as we start to really work back to normal capacity, it is meaning that all of a sudden we have more things that are sort of in stream. I'll say in stream, looking at the coast here off of the Los Angeles harbor, but even things like border patrols, having new controls put in place for borders and mobility restrictions, not countries in the world not having a global vaccine pass, so people just being able to get the goods off the ships. And then, all of these things have helped to contribute to where we are today. And so what they're saying is that the supply is going to take some time to catch up, and that the bottlenecks are happening in every link of the supply chain. And so this includes things not just in containers and shipping and ports, but also with our trucks, our railroads, our air, as well as our warehouses. And they're talking, for example, around the California area, trying to figure out where you can build more warehouses. Well, sometimes the supply of land is also an issue for that. The global truck driver shortage. So I thought the truck driver shortage was really a US thing, but it is actually a global challenge. It's not just in the US where we are short um, truck drivers, but Germany is having a really big issue with truck drivers as well. But things like power outages and shortages in China have produced challenges as well. With and then Brexit happening kind of at the same time as the pandemic has also impacted the shortage of truck drivers. And so one of the things that we're really seeing and that we're pretty much all aware of is that the pandemic has highlighted the fragility of our networks. Things that we've been talking about for years have come to reality. And what we're seeing in reality is that one part of the chain being disrupted is having that ripple down effect in all parts of the chain. And this is, from the manufacturers to the suppliers to the distributors themselves. And this is, of course, impacting consumers as well. And so when we see bottlenecks like this and congestion in the production system, we're seeing shortages in things like electronics and automobiles, where we can't get the semiconductor chips that, or just like the distribution of food, where food is rotting because they can't get it out fast enough. So really what the point of today's webinar is, we're going to be talking about things that I've been talking about for years, but it's all coming to fruition now. And it's been very clear how interconnected and how easily destabilized our supply chains can be. And so let's start with our first poll. And I really just want to get kind of a test on this is, to what extent is your organization been impacted by disruption to your supply chain? And so if Bob could go ahead and launch our poll, really looking at, we've not experienced any impact. We've experienced some impact, primarily with just delays. We've experienced moderate impact where we're seeing delays and or loss or more of one of our suppliers. Or we've seen significant delays where maybe you have a loss or impact from multiple tier 1 suppliers, for example. We'll give you about 10 more seconds. We're not going to give you a lot of time for polls because we figure you probably know if you have experienced an impact or not. All right, it looks like most of you have voted. So Bob, if you want to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. The results are not really too surprising. I am surprised that 21% of you have not experienced any impact, but my guess is, like a lot of us, we work in an office. So, like in my case, my office, we don't have any impact because we don't have anything to produce. We're producing services. So if your organization is producing services, you're probably not having a supplier disruption. You're probably more or less having a disruption to the fact that your workers aren't able to produce the services that they were producing. But about 46%, or almost half of you, have seen some impact, and primarily with delays. And then the tie here kind of goes to the moderate and significant. And so, one of the things that I would be interested in knowing is if you want to share it in the questions piece, or just share afterwards, what are some of those of you that have said that you have significant impacts, if you'd be willing to share, what those impacts have been or what the causes have been, so that we can kind of share between us like we would be doing in an in-person event, sharing some of the things that we've experienced. So thank you, Bob, for sharing the poll. We can go ahead and close that. And so the question becomes, how do we manage the risk of supply chain disruptions? We've seen that they're a reality. We've seen that there's economic consequences. So what can we do about it? Well, my hypothesis was, let's move to a localized supply chain. If we can't get our stuff to us because it's too far away, then bring it closer. We need to reshore versus offshore. We need to regionalize. Let's bring it all back in. So if I'm in Chicago, maybe my first step is I want to bring it into the United States or North America. And maybe my second step is that, I want to bring it into the Midwest. I don't even know, around the Chicago area. So that would be my solution. Now, of course, I want you to know that I am not an economics professor or an expert, and I'm not an expert in managing a supply chain. However, this seems logical to me. So this was the hypothesis that we built this webinar around. And this is not a this I wasn't the only one thinking this, because at the end of 2020, policymakers, a lot of countries and people that are making policy in different countries and their governments were starting to wonder whether a more localized production of your key goods would provide greater security against disruptions. And so let's take a look at that. So McKinsey did a study at the end of 2020 to look at what are some of the factors impacting the business case for making a geographic shift, for bringing things closer to you. And so they broke those into economic factors and then non-economic factors. So all of the things that are economic factors are things they're arguing as to why we can't do this, why it doesn't make sense to bring things back locally. The first one is this idea of capital intensity and economies of scale. For the reason that most organizations have moved to a global supply chain is because that they can get these economies of scale, and they can get them at a cost that they can't get that's more local. And so your companies have invested in this, and so in order to change that, you might lose billions of dollars in fixed investments. You've already made that investment of money, so you're going to have to reinvest that money in order to bring it back regionally. And then one of the things I had never even considered was this idea of knowledge intensity. I assumed the suppliers, having a specialized supplier ecosystem, like, this can only be produced here. But I hadn't really considered knowledge intensity of the people that have been trained in the supply chain in those regional areas to actually provide the goods and services that you're looking for. So if you're going to move that, that means there's going to be a loss of knowledge that you're going to have to account for. And that piece as well, you've already invested money into that, so you're going to need to acknowledge that. The one that was the most obvious to me was the access to natural resources. Well, you can't, if you have your production happening in a region because they have access to natural resources like agriculture or mining or energy or some basic metals, you can't just move that to a different country because might not be there. When we look at demand growth too, is a lot of times we'll be producing something closest to where we want to sell it. And so having that is a piece to consider as well. And then I think these are all equally important, but this idea of product complexity and really the inability to substitute inputs into a product. So when you're looking at supply chain itself, and what are your sole source suppliers, for example, you can only get this part from one place. And so what we're seeing more and more is that a lot of products are depending on inputs or pieces that are only being able to be provided by one or two suppliers in the world. And we're all depending on those same one or two suppliers. And so the question becomes, when you're creating your product or you're updating your product, what's the possibility that you can you can have parts that are more substitutable with other parts so that you can use those if they're not available. But then let's look at non-economic factors. And the non-economic factors tend to come from policymakers and governments for reasons like they want to bolster your national security. They want to safeguard your technologies that you're producing because they might have civilian or military implications. We want to increase our national competitiveness. We want to be self-sufficient. And so, and then we want to also pursue industrial policies intended to capture leading shares in emerging technologies. These are all really good non-economic factors. However, what they have found is that with few exceptions, the economic and non-economic feasibility of geographic shifts really do not overlap, and that countries would have to be prepared to expend, we'll just say, a lot of money to induce shifts that were otherwise economically optimal for those production footprints. And so we really need to consider the fact that due to economic factors, even given the non-economic factors, it's not going to be really financially viable to make that geographic shift. So just to kind of summarize that, what they're finding is that more localized regimes deliver neither greater efficiency nor greater stability. And this, one of the things I want you to notice here is on each of these slides, we've given a reference. So at the end of the presentation, like Bob said, you will get a list of those references. And I would strongly recommend that you look at these papers and you look at these pieces that have been produced by different governments as well as different organizations, and not just believe what I'm telling you. I'm just summarizing from what I've read, but there's a lot more detail in those papers that can be shared here very quickly. And I'm not an economics person, so you can get a better understanding or more in-depth understanding about looking at that. But I do, the results from all of these are very similar. You're not going to get more efficiency or greater stability. You're actually going to add to economic losses, and your domestic economies become more vulnerable if you do this. It also means that you have reliance on fewer sources and often more expensive inputs. Remember, inputs are considered parts in the supply chain world. And so when you have a disruption in your supply chain and everything is more local, it's going to be very hard for you to find ready substitutes, which then gives you rise to that greater risk or insecurity of your supply itself. So the localization of production is costly for the most developed countries, and it's virtually impossible for those less developed. And so at the same time, a localized regime is also going to provide you less protection from the impact of shocks. So to summarize, it's too late to localize. It's just too late. The world has become too complex, and it's time to move on and think about what else can we do to strengthen our supply chains. And so I want to start with just kind of a basic understanding of what we're talking about. So there are generally three disciplines that support building a more supply chain. The first one is supply chain risk. And I'm just referencing international standards here because that is what I know, but there's also lots of other things that you can reference as well. But looking at supply chain risk management looks at managing risk to your demand, to your supplies, to your environment. There's process risk and then network or control risk. And network, by the way, is not technology, it's the actual transportation network. When we look at supply chain continuity, for those of you that are more involved in the continuity side of things, I'm sure I hope you've identified the criticality of each of your products, that you've identified where you have multi-source or single source suppliers, that you've been looking at the preparedness of your suppliers themselves. And if you haven't before, you probably should have been doing it in the last 18 months. And then something that people often forget about is what priority do you have in the suppliers list of critical customers? And as I bring up some some graphs and some pictures coming up, I want you to think about that. Where do you sit in their kind of that value customer chain piece? Meaning, are you number one on their list? If they only have 10% of their product, do you get all of it, or are you not even on their list yet? So understanding where that is. And that's something that you need to really be looking at, with procurement and your supply chain people who are managing that and all of the contracts that go with that. So you need to be looking at your risk side, you need to be looking at your continuity side, and then the security side looks at things like cargo management, where we've seen lots of disruptions happening. The management of the facilities themselves, like your distribution centers, your information management, which we've seen has been hacked for a lot of organizations, and then the HR side of that, the people who are actually part of your supply chain itself. And so understand that there is overlap between each of these disciplines, and they need to be implemented as a single system. So we need to get rid of these silos. So your risk people need to be talking to the continuity people, and they need to be talking to your supply chain security people. So again, some basics, you need to buy your products, you need to make the products, you need to move them, they need to be stored somewhere, and they need to be delivered. And what we're seeing right now is really those blocks in the delivery of those, or even just getting them moved from one place to another so that they even can be stored. When we're looking at supply chains, we're looking at two basic pieces. One are called nodes, and those would be considered your suppliers. Those are the circles. And you should have different tiers of those based on how important they are to you. And in this case, tier 1 is the most important, and tier 3 would be the least important. And we're only talking about 1, 2, and 3 here today, because what you're going to see is that most organizations don't have great visibility beyond tier 2. And so even going beyond that, and hopefully your supply chain isn't complex enough to go beyond tier 3. But then we've got links, and those are the straight lines, and that's how you transport between your suppliers and yourself. So understanding, how is your product transported? Is it something that goes by truck, by ship, by air, by all of those things? How is it transported? And then when you look at your critical suppliers, this supplier, who are they depending on? So this is those tier two types of suppliers. And then looking at, okay, in this case, one of our critical suppliers is using emerging market suppliers for their tier two. And so what does that mean? What kind of risk is that adding? And then you have a supplier that's single or sole source. What kind of risk is that bringing to you? And then you're seeing, well, this is great. We have three tiers in this supplier, but they have local redundancy. That's great. Except, whoops, our critical supplier number one and our second one are both dependent on a tier three supplier. And so in reality, you think you've diversified, but in reality, you're all stuck with that tier three supplier that's really taking out two of your four suppliers for what you need. So this is when we talk about having transparency to your supply chain. You need to understand where you're getting all of your parts and goods that you need to provide that you are selling. So one of the things that we look at is this idea of supply and value chain. So we're seeing more and more of the term value chain, so I want to bring that up just a little bit. And this picture kind of gives you a very simple idea of that. But if your organization sits at layer 0, and then you've got your suppliers at layer 1, and they might be, your tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, and then looking at who do they depend on. So this first supplier is depending on supplier 4 and 5. Your second supplier is actually depending on suppliers 4, 6, and 7. So you've got some double support there needed, or your dependencies there. And supplier 3 is dependent on supplier 7 and 8, but also this supplier 2 is dependent on supplier 7 as well. So here is where you start to see some of the complexity. And then as you start going out to your customer value chain, you're using a distributor to get to your products to customers 1 and 2. You're delivering directly to customer 2. You're also delivering directly to customer 3. And then you're using a distributor to deliver to customer 4. So this is kind of looking at this from the value chain on, as once it leaves your organization, where is it going? So the question is, what we're talking about terms. And I always like to define terms. And usually I define my terms at the very beginning, but this in case I'm defining it as we're just getting started. But we're looking at, oftentimes the value chain is being used to talk about all the way from your supplier to your customer. In other cases, they use the value chain to be once it leaves your company. So they're really related, and it doesn't really matter. In fact, as you saw in the news, they were using supply chain to mean value chain as well. So again, it doesn't really matter which terms you use, but just understand that they're very closely related, and they're really just looking at things from different perspectives. So supply chain often looks at your flow of resources from your supplier to your customer, or your value chain is looking from your customer to the buyer and how you get that, from you out to the people that you're selling to. And so looking at kind of like that upstream versus your downstream focus. And so let's look at our next poll. And I want to just get a really quick idea from you. To what extent does your organization have visibility to its supply chain? And so the first thing is, we've got it mapped, and we've got strategies for any of our sole or single source suppliers. We've mapped our supply chain to tier 1 and tier 2, or we need to begin this process, or I really don't know because it's not part of what I do for my job. So we'll give you about 10 or 15 seconds to take a look at that. I'm not sure. It looked like it was open and then it closed and it's back open again, but let's take a look. I am not surprised to see a large number of you saying you don't know. And if you're in risk management or business continuity or both, and you don't know, and you haven't had visibility on this during the pandemic, it's time that you do, because as you can see, supply chain disruption should have always been part of business continuity. But the visibility to what depth of knowledge do you have is really interesting. So Bob, if you want to go ahead and close that poll. I am kind of surprised that that there's 15% of you that, if you look at 15% saying you need to be getting mapping and 30% not knowing, that's about, almost half of you that are really not sure. So I'm hoping that the knowledge that you take from this webinar today will help to inform you about some of the questions that you need to be asking. It is great that 45% of you have mapped your supply chain to tier 1 and tier 2. This is the most normal, and the fact that you're aware of that is also great. And I would hope, as business continuity people, that you know who your single and sole source suppliers are. So that would be something that you would think would come out in any of your business impact analysis as well. So thank you for sharing the results for this. We know that all supply chains face risks, and the more complex and global your supply chain, the greater your exposure is going to be. So let's look at back to the question, what can you do about it? So the first thing you really need to know is you need to look at your supply chain. And so this is kind of the global you in this aspect. When was the last time you really looked at how effectively your supply chain is performing? So obviously most of you are probably not responsible for managing your supply chain. So the question I would ask as a business continuity and risk person is when was the last time we really looked at this, and how closely are we looking at this because of the results of the pandemic, and what is it costing us? What's our performance been? And what about quality and value? Is the supply chain performing to the specification of your supply chain strategy? Do you have a supply chain strategy? So a question you might want to be asking is, what is our supply chain strategy and how well is it working? And making sure that it's in alignment with your corporate strategy. Anything around resilience, you're always talking about how aligned is whatever this aspect is with your corporate strategy. And one of the measures of resilience is that everything's in alignment and everybody's pointing in the same direction. And then the question becomes, are your suppliers aware of your supply chain strategy? And do they know what their part is in helping to achieve this? And what this is really starting to get you thinking about is the fact that your organization needs to be building relationships with its suppliers. And sometimes that means that you're actually purchasing your suppliers just because maybe it's less money and it works better for you. And you see this happening a lot. But the fact is that your supply chain is part of your success as an organization, and they're part of a risk to your organization. And so you need to build relationships with them, and they need to understand what role they play in your organization as well. So we're looking at how can we really improve and optimize our supply chain process. Like I just mentioned, everything needs to be in alignment. And so when you're looking at your future growth and innovation and how you're going to be sustainable, you need to make sure your supply chain strategy is actively aligned and supports that. You need to identify your suppliers who are going to help you achieve those goals and make sure that you're collaborating and providing a means of growing those mutual businesses. And when I talk about collaboration, this is collaboration with a big C. This is, like I just mentioned, creating relationships with your suppliers and making sure that you both understand what you're doing and what are your capabilities and capacity to work together. Of course, you need to manage risk. There should be a well thought out risk management plan for your supply chain. You also need to have a comprehensive view, and this is a topic we're going to kind of pound into you today, is the performance of your entire supply chain must be examined in order to identify both those current and potential future constraints. And so right now our current is very visible to us. And so it's important for you to look to the future as well, because if we only look at the current bottlenecks, you might fail to recognize future constraints, though I will argue right now is that because we're having so many bottlenecks, it's a great opportunity for you to start looking at what they are. And you also need to have some way to measure. If you've been in any of the other webinars that I've done, I always talk about metrics and measuring. If you're not measuring what you're doing, how do you know how well you're doing and how do you improve it? And if you don't measure the right things, you're going to be uninformed or poorly informed. And so you need, by establishing a comprehensive view of your supply chain, this helps improve your visibility and responsiveness through all tiers of supporting that. So, we've been to a lot of Continuity Insights conferences, and every year we hear speakers who talk about the fact is that how do you get top management support? How do you get visibility? How do you get top management and senior management to recognize what they should be doing? Well, if they're not paying attention now, I don't think you'll ever get their attention, because obviously this pandemic has delivered the biggest and broadest value chain shock in recent memory. But remember that it's actually the latest in a long series of disruptions. So even 10 years ago, with that earthquake and tsunami in Japan, we thought this will get their attention. You know, Japan shut down factories that produced electronic components that we needed for cars. There were assembly lines shut down, and it really gave us the first really big knock on the production of those advanced silicon wafers, which semiconductors companies rely on. But just a few months later, we had flooding in factories in Thailand that produced roughly, this has got to be, this is a huge number, 25% of the world's hard drives, leaving the makers of personal computers scrambling. So here you've got your silicone wafers being impacted, now your hard drives being impacted. And then a few years later, we had Hurricane Harvey, which produced shortages in, in plastics and things. And I was talking to a friend of mine who works in the personal care business, and I was like, what the heck? What's going on? Why is it that my shampoo and my conditioner and all of my personal care products are costing more money, and they're all in smaller packages? So not only did the price increase, I'm getting less for my money. And the answer was Hurricane Harvey, because the materials made that are used to make the containers for most of those personal care products come from the oil industry, and so it wasn't available, so they had to come up with other things to do to manage that. But the latest thing that we're really seeing is we're becoming what's called a multipolar world, and we're seeing more trade disputes, higher tariffs, and we're seeing a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, and this is also something that we need to continue to be aware of. So we're seeing shocks that affect global production are growing, more frequent and more severe. We're seeing that the supply chains are exposed to different types of shocks based on their geographic footprint, different factors of production and other variables. So we're going to take a closer look at that next. And we know that operational choices can heighten or lessen those vulnerability to shocks. So consider the fact, this idea of just in time, your lean supply chain, your just in supply chain, all of these things that became enabled with the global supply and value chain and with technology have now actually producing a risk to us because we don't have enough on stock and in hand to be able to operate very long. We might not have saved much money and put money aside or invested money to manage when we do have a disruption. And we know that they can cause substantial financial losses. So we're going to take a look at what some of those are as well. But just this idea of the interconnected nature of our supply chains really limits that, like as I said before, that case for making large scale changes in your physical location. And so we need to look at how can you build more resilience beyond relocating your production facilities. So I really liked this chart that came out from McKinsey, and what they wanted to really demonstrate, number one is that they're becoming more frequent and severe. So in the upper left-hand corner, we've seen lots of different causes of disruptions, but things that are coming forward now that maybe we haven't seen so much in the past is like macroeconomic financial crises, trade disputes. Obviously, we're seeing the pandemic. Things like cyber attacks are becoming more prevalent, as well as terrorism. And I think here, when we look at climate change, both chronic and acute, they're using climate change for weather-related types of disasters. But then also looking at the disruption length. And so what we're seeing is the length and interval of disruptions is changing. So every 2 years, if you're looking at now statistics and things that you can bring back to your organization, is that every 2 years, you should expect a disruption of about 1 to 2 weeks. Every 2.5 to 3 years, you should expect a disruption of 2 to 4 weeks. Every 3.5 years, between 1 and 2 months. And every almost 5 years, 2 or more months. So consider the cost of that. And this is going to help inform your planning and your risk management and what kind of strategies you put in place to try to mitigate the length of your disruption, as well as how often that you're impacted, and looking at how much money needs to be set aside for that. But then also looking at the fact that some value chains or supply chains are more exposed to shock than others. So from the left to the right, what we're seeing is that semiconductors, the aerospace industry, computers and electronics, petroleum products, apparel and communication equipment are more exposed, with communication equipment being the most exposed industry right now. So what they then did is they looked at different types of shocks based on their impact, their lead time, and the frequency of occurrence. And so one of the things that they were looking into factors here is that the impact of a shock can be influenced by how long it lasts, the ripple effects it has across geographies and industries, and whether a shock hits the supply side alone or also hits the demand side. And so the four kind of quadrants here from left to right and top to bottom are having unanticipated catastrophes, foreseeable catastrophes, and then at the bottom, unanticipated business disruptions versus foreseeable. So kind of the unanticipated versus a foreseeable, and then moving from a disruption to a catastrophe. So whatever terms you use are less important as this idea that you should have an idea of what you're planning for and what sorts of things you need to plan for that might not be foreseeable. So things like in the bottom right quadrant, heat waves, having a military conflict that's localized, or new regulatory things are really foreseeable disruptions, but these can impact you for a long time. Where having a theft or what they call a common cyber attack. Again, I'll argue with the fact that, um, in my opinion, a cyber attack is painful no matter what. But things like counterfeit, having a supplier bankruptcy, these are things that are more frequent. So the darker color means more frequent, and the gray actually means it hasn't occurred yet at scale, meaning it may have occurred, but not at a volume or scale that we need to recognize yet. But then when we move to, I was sort of curious, foreseeable catastrophes includes both a pandemic and an extreme pandemic. And so here's where I was saying, okay, we've obviously a pandemic is less frequent, but it's foreseeable. It's here, but how does that differentiate what we're currently going through to an extreme pandemic? And I guess my argument, or what I would say, is that the fact that we have vaccines made so readily available and we do have options for getting back to normal has made this to be not extreme. But the duration has been something that I think, other than the experts, has been less foreseeable by some of us. My son's an immunologist and infectious disease person, and he immediately said, "Mom, don't even think about anything. This is going to impact for at least 2 years." And I think that is proving true, and that's what the experts told us. It might not be what we wanted to hear, but that still doesn't make it extreme. So what would an extreme look like? And then when you look at unanticipated, are things like, a solar storm or extreme terrorism or a systemic cyber attack. And these really bump up things like, a major geophysical event, which we've seen. Things like hurricanes, we've had terrorisms, and we've had things like trade disputes. So these are things. The main output from this is that they're becoming more frequent and severe, and we should be categorizing them as part of our planning efforts. Just like any other measurement of risk, you're looking kind of at your exposure and your vulnerability. And so that is pretty much the same. But what I really wanted you to focus on here is an acronym I wasn't aware of, is that EBITDA on the right, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And companies can expect to lose 40% of a year's earnings every 10 years. And so looking at that and thinking about how you need to invest in order to minimize these losses so that can really pay off in the long term. So let's go to our third poll, and really looking at, to what extent does your organization have an understanding of the cause and cost of supply and value chain disruptions, as far as what you know right now. So looking at, have you identified potential causes and have you documented those costs? Have you identified potential causes, but maybe not costs themselves? Because of COVID, this is something we're starting to do, or I don't know. Again, this is not really part of our risk management VC programs. So looking at that engagement piece and how siloed your organization is. And interestingly enough, what we're seeing is that about half of you have identified potential causes, but not the costs. And this is what I was expecting, especially if it's not really part of what if it's not included in your risk management and business continuity. If your organization is more siloed, you might not have really good documentation of that. So what we're seeing is about half of you have identified causes, and about a third of you are in a pretty decent place where you've identified both the causes and the costs. And I would imagine that this is because this is included in some of the data that you gather and report back to the organization as well. And again, if you don't know, this is a question is that, you know, why don't you know, and how can you go about getting your organization to kind of unsilo? So thank you, Bob, for sharing that. This is kind of a complex chart, and actually it's a big chart that I broke down into two pieces, just so it would show on a slide. And this is why I recommend that you go and look at some of these papers, because you can really, they'll give you some of the analysis of this too. But the key thing is that the lower the number one is bad, and the darker the color is bad. So here you're looking at a value chain in the chemical, the pharmaceutical, aerospace, and so on industries. And they're giving these industries an overall shock exposure number. So it's some data. And again, that number one means you're most exposed. And then they're looking at exposures from specific shocks, things like a pandemic, a large scale cyber attack, a geophysical event like a natural disaster type of thing, heat stress, flooding, and a trade dispute. So what understanding here is that the large scale cyber attack are the ones that are giving us the most exposure. So that you see actually 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all under that. So these are things that everybody in this area are very exposed to. Secondly is a trade dispute, which really surprised me. But I guess it's because you're not getting, these are not localized chains, right? You're getting these things from other countries. And so there was a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 under trade disputes. And then which industries are most exposed? And here your communication equipment, like we said earlier, was the most exposed. They're number one. They actually have 1, 2s, and 3s. And the transportation equipment was kind of number 2. They have a number 4 overall shock exposure. So here is where understanding how your industry is impacted based on geographic footprint really becomes important. So depending on what your company does, you may have less or more exposure based on where you get your supplies from. Looking at other industries, so we're looking at furniture, textile, and apparel, which is very labor intensive, and then looking at prefabricated metal products, rubber and plastic, food and beverage. This is much more regional processing. And then things that are more resource intensive, like your agriculture, your metals, and your mining products. And again, looking at those same exposure categories. In this case, heat stress was a bigger exposure, and flooding was the second one. And then thirdly was the pandemic. So this is interesting. This is why I split it this way as well, is that based on the industry that you're in, your actual exposure to shocks based on your geographic footprint could change. And here is where the apparel industry is because heat and flooding puts you out of work. And guess what? Your people aren't available as well. So the apparel industry being very labor intensive. I don't know about you, but my mom tried to get a couch, and it took her 1 year. She ordered her couch in April of 2020. Actually, I think she got it in June of 2021. Furniture, your deliveries, and just getting those things put together. If they're based on people putting those things together, it's going to have a longer or bigger exposure. Secondly was petroleum products. And third was the mining, any types of mining. But this is where I think I want you to go back and consider that nice little picture we started with the basics of your supply chain and looking at your tiers. Your tiered suppliers. I had like 4 nice little suppliers that were tier 1, and then we had some tier 2 and tier 3. So this is there's actually several of these in this McKinsey report, but what they looked at was Dell's, and I never know how to say this. I'm just going to say Lenovo, hoping I'm having the accent on the right syllables here. But looking at what they have done is to map their known tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, because they qualified this by saying that they're not aware that they may not be aware of all of their tier 2 suppliers. And then so you look at how complex this is and all of the different movement here. And you're looking at things like your semiconductor manufacturers, your software companies, your electronics manufacturers. You've got chemicals in there as well. And then looking at your mobile phone and communication devices, where you get your chemicals and plastics, and looking at the fact that the ones in blue, that turquoise color, are the ones that are shared. So if Dell has, 4,700 suppliers that are about 7,000 suppliers that are total, out of that, 2,200 of them are shared. And then the same thing um, if Lenovo has about little over 6,000 suppliers, 2,200 of those are shared with Dell. So this is why the communications and technology industries are very vulnerable, because they have very complex supply chains and they share a lot of those same suppliers. And I think another one that they did was on the apparel industry, and showing two major companies and how they overlapped as well. And so how can we build resilience in your supply chain? We need to make supply chains more transparent. We know that. But only a small group of leading companies have really taken decisive action. And that's why even just being able to share what they've done into mapping that is interesting. We've seen past disasters and we haven't seen industry-wide changes. Like we say, everybody talks about the weather, but nobody wants to do anything about it. But we're hoping that maybe now is finally different. Maybe the price tag that we're feeling with these disruptions, it's been growing over time, and now we actually are seeing a worst case scenario with the pandemic. So maybe this will get the attention of your leadership and you can start doing something about it. And let's get rid of those silos between who's managing and planning for disruptions. So the first thing you need to do is just strengthen supply chain risk management. And I would say that includes the security. I'm just going to say the risk management side of this, what the way they're using it includes continuity, and it includes security. But you need to improve your end-to-end transparency. One of the things that's been very noticeable is that only the largest and most advanced global economies have built permanent supply chain risk management teams into what they're doing. In other words, there are people assigned to do this, and this is their only job. And they're busy monitoring, they're busy assessing the potential impact of various scenarios, and they're establishing those robust business continuity plans to keep critical operations running. Excuse me. And so all of these things means that we need to be planning all the time for this. And so having this centralized nerve center of people that are responsible for this really helps to coordinate all facets of response and recovery. You also need to minimize exposure to your shocks. So you need to diversify your supplier network and your geographic footprint. So whether you might not be able to regionalize, but maybe you can diversify the footprint itself based on the risks of where your suppliers are located. You need to build in alternatives to transportation and logistics systems. I remember hearing a story years and years ago about a country in South America that literally was relying on bicycles. And I think like in the not Philippines, in like Thailand, they were relying on tuk-tuks to transport things, because the logistics had become such a mess that was the only way to get through. Trucks weren't able to get through. I'm assuming it was part of some sort of a natural disaster where the roads weren't available. But you need to strengthen your critical suppliers or bring those key production in-house. And so helping to make sure that your suppliers are able to handle disruptions as well. And then looking at how can you move it to a more modular design so that you can have standardized inputs so you're not reliant on a single or sole source. And then looking at your actual physical assets and how you can harden those to withstand natural disasters. You also need to improve your financial and operational capacity. So increase your inventory and safety stock. This idea of lean has been great, but it doesn't always work. It produces vulnerabilities for you. Looking at how you can flex production across different suppliers and different production sites. Looking at creating cash flow and balance sheet buffers for that includes your suppliers. And again, how can you build supplier financial health? You want your suppliers to provide you what you need to strengthen them. What they're really saying is you need to have responsibility for your suppliers. It's kind of like taking care of your children, I guess. I was speaking there as a mother. But you also need, we've said, map your supply and value chain in detail. So you need to know where your supply chain is, and we need to look beyond tier 1 and tier 2, but at least tier 1 and tier 2 at minimum. A lot of our suppliers are relying on critical components from tiers that they're not even aware of. And so having that full transparency is really vitally important. And we are able to do that now. Technology is in place to, we often talk about, and I don't sell any products, but even just getting your business continuity management system and part of a software tool. Well, the fact is that there's tools for supply chain, and they've been around for a long time that help you to monitor, by the way. They can literally monitor where your products are in production, where they are in the transportation nodes, and helps you then to, okay, this isn't happening here. You can see kind of in that picture, there's red dots. We're having a stoppage here. So how can we then move to one of our other suppliers or one of our other transportation nodes? And we've got the technology in place. And so we really need to connect the entire value and supply chain in this seamless flow of data, and making sure you have, again, a centralized control system and people that manage that and that look at that and look at weather forecasts, look at potential disruptions for, whether it's a government related issue or a strike or whatever it is, just looking at all the different types of scenarios that you need to have in place to help you then make your digital and your electronic experience better. So we looked at, what are some strategies to increase your supply chain resilience? And back in 2020, 93% of supply chain leaders said they're going to make some plans to make their organization more resilient. And 44% of them said they're going to do that even at the expense of their short-term savings. And so what were they going to do? Well, 53% are going to do some dual sourcing of their raw materials. They're going to increase inventory of their critical products. They're going to do some nearshoring and expanding of their supplier base. They're going to regionalize the parts of the supply chain they can. They're going to reduce the number of SKUs in your product portfolio. So I think one of the funniest, not necessarily funny, but we talk about toilet paper, and here in the United States, we have rows and rows in our stores with toilet paper, and you'll see one company that has like 8 different types of toilet paper. Well, now they only maybe have 2. So we're just seeing the number of types of products reducing, keeping higher inventory, backing up your production sites, and that kind of thing. And then the last one was really increasing number of distribution centers. And then looking at how these strategies vary by industry, and I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on this, but looking at those same 5 strategies and looking at what kinds of things can you do by industry. So, dual sourcing of raw materials is something that could be done in construction and engineering and infrastructure. Increasing your inventory of critical products is more likely to happen in your healthcare and pharmaceuticals and medical type devices. Nearshoring and expansion of your supplier base is something that you could do for your automotive and aerospace, where your, metals and mining, you're not going to be able to do much about. So just looking at sort of that sort of thing. The same thing with your advanced electronics and semiconductors. They're relying on minerals that are in the ground. So I just wanted to let you know that the study that we've been looking at were things that companies said that they were going to do. Just this week, McKinsey has published an update. So I've included that. So when you guys send out from Continuity Insights the links, make sure that this is included. I did include it on the links to the references as well. But they're looking at what has changed, what have actually people done in 2021. So instead, we just said that companies were originally planning to near source their suppliers. They ended up increasing inventory instead because of the cost. About 90% said that they were going to pursue some degree of regionalization during the next 3 years, but notice they tried to do it in 2021 and it didn't work. Every surveyed industry has invested in supply chain advanced analytics, even during COVID. So this is something that industry itself has gained from, because companies are finally putting that money in to make that happen. They're making those digital investments is really helping them to look at visibility and planning. But one of the things that they're maybe not doing so much is monitoring the supply chain disruption itself. And one of the biggest problem is that they're purchasing the tools, but they don't have the talent to actually use them. 1% of the companies report having sufficient talent. That's a crazy number. So they've gone out in 2021 and they've spent the money on the tools, but now they need to spend the money on the people. So if you're looking for a new job, this might be an area where you where you learn from. That's my joke for the day. But anyways, looking at what they said they were going to do and what they're actually doing were two different things. So I wanted to close with the opinion of the World Trade Organization and kind of with that same argument or hypothesis that I started with, and looking at the discussion of arguments on the value chain organization itself. And the COVID pandemic could contribute to diversification of sources of supply. And that extent is really going to vary depending on the cost of that reorganization itself. We know that the pandemic has led to increased attention to the provision of essential goods in situations of crisis. And their analysis concludes that to achieve this objective, global cooperation is preferred to national policies such as domestic production and export restrictions. And they just kind of wanted to emphasize that the largest risk for the global economy in the aftermath of the pandemic is to move away from that open or non-discriminatory trade policies, which would really jeopardize the large benefits of those open trade regimes. And so they say this is going to be the biggest issue. So to finish up today, I'd like to finish with a poll and ask you, which of the following strategies to increase the resilience of your supply and value chain can you begin to implement, or can you think your company can begin to implement in 2022? So do you think you can better map your supply and value chains to gain better transparency? Can you review your geographic footprint to understand better your regional risk? And you can choose all that apply for this one, by the way, so you can choose more than one. Can you try to collaborate better with your supply chain functions? And can you improve your financial and operational capacity? Here's a big question. If your company's been struggling with finances, it's going to be hard for them to improve that maybe at this time, but not all have been. So we'll go about maybe 5 more seconds. About half of you have voted, so maybe if we can get a few more votes. It looks like most of you want to try to get a better collaboration, which to me is the easiest fix. You already have the people, so let's just get them to work together so that knowledge is shared. And that's 70% of you thought that you could do that. Obviously, if you're not already doing it, you need to map your value and supply chain. So we had over 50% for that, and then kind of split looking at your geographic footprint and improving the financial things. These are all viable things that you should be doing. And it's a takeaway, coming back at least, hopefully what you're getting is some questions that you can ask to your leadership, and so that you're a little bit more knowledgeable in your questions. So just to summarize, coming on the heels of Brexit, as well as a flare-up with the US and China trade tensions, the COVID pandemic has really forced businesses to focus on building resilience in their supply chains. If we haven't got your attention, we hope you have it now. We know that not everything that can go wrong actually does go wrong, but what we're really seeing is that everything has been going wrong at the same time. And so what companies that have numerous strategies available to mitigate risks and minimize disruptions do better than those that don't. But the time to commit to them is well before the event occurs. And at least we've got their attention, and it's time we have the resources. Most companies have the resources right now to start committing to planning for how to mitigate in the future, because we're getting through this pandemic. And so understanding that investing in resilience takes discipline, and it takes a long-term view. But we see that in this increasing volatile world, preparing for a wide range of eventualities is really a must. Like I said, we've got a lot of references here. Please take a look at those. And I know we don't really have much time left, but we'd be happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to stick around. And if we run out of time, I'm happy to answer questions sent by email as well.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Linda. That was excellent content. Really, some really good resources. Since we're coming up on the top of the hour, we clearly could have gone another 30 minutes on this topic. So I would urge all of you to reach out to Linda at the email address shown on the screen. So since we're able to get to your questions today, please feel free to reach out to Linda. As a reminder, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar on Continuity Insights in a few days. So if you missed any part of today's broadcast or would like to share it with any of your colleagues, you'll get a link to that. Thank you again, Linda, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar addressing supply chain chaos and disruption, increasing the resilience of your supply chain. On behalf of Continuity Insights, Linda, and our corporate sponsor, OnSolve, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.